The engineer heard them coming before anyone above ground knew a thing was wrong. It was past midnight, in a room with no windows, buried under a warehouse on the ragged southern edge of West Berlin. He had sat in that chair for 11 months. The tape reels turned. The Soviet lines carried their usual weather, a quartermaster shouting about diesel, an officer somewhere complaining about the damp, the ordinary murmur of an army that believed it was talking in private. Then the traffic changed. Soviet signal crews were on the very cables he was tapping, and they were not making calls. They were hunting a fault. He listened to them test one line, then another, working closer to the single spot in all of Berlin that could never be found. Men with shovels moving along the cable a few feet at a time, getting warmer. Upstairs, someone sent a message back to headquarters. It survives in the record, and it is not the language of a confident superpower. Every precaution had been taken, the message said, including the primary one, crossing fingers. They were about to lose the most valuable secret the West owned in Europe, and the men with the shovels were speaking Russian. The only question left in that room was the one nobody wanted to say out loud. How long had the other side known this was here? To understand why grown men in tailored suits agreed to dig a hole under a hostile army, you have to understand what Berlin had become by the early 1950s. The war was over, the next one had not started, and both sides were quietly certain it might at any hour, on any morning. Berlin sat more than 100 miles inside Soviet-controlled territory, a single city carved into slices, American, British, French, and Soviet, like a cake that 4 people intended to eat alone. Nowhere else on the planet did the two great enemies of the age stand so close they could read the signs on each other's buildings, and nowhere else were both so completely blind. The Americans had a problem they could not admit in public. Their spies inside the Soviet bloc kept vanishing. Networks went silent. Agents stopped reporting. The men in Washington could feel the size of the Soviet military the way you feel a shape in a dark room. Massive, near, impossible to measure. They did not know how many divisions sat east of the line. They did not know if those divisions were about to move. And in a nuclear age, not knowing was the thing that could get everyone killed. For a while, radio had been the answer. The Soviets talked, the West listened, and the airwaves gave up their secrets. But the Soviets were not fools. They noticed. And slowly, deliberately, they moved their most sensitive conversations off the radio and down into the ground, into buried telephone and telegraph cables, where no antenna could reach them. That single decision is the reason the tunnel exists. The West had lost the sky, so it looked down. There was a rehearsal for this. Few people know it, and it matters. In Vienna a few years earlier, British intelligence had done something small and almost absurd. Vienna was also a divided city, also crawling with occupiers, and the British had run a modest tunnel from a shop out towards Soviet phone lines and simply listened. It worked. It was quiet, it was cheap, and it fed London a steady trickle of Soviet chatter for years. They called it Silver. The man who ran it was named Peter Lunn. He does not look, on paper, like a spymaster. Before the war, he had been an Olympic skier, small and soft-spoken, the kind of man other men underestimated exactly once. Lunn had a gift for the patient, unglamorous work of intelligence, the waiting, the listening, the willingness to spend a year gaining an inch. When Lunn was posted to Berlin, he brought the idea with him. If a little tunnel could drink from Soviet lines in Vienna, what could a bigger one do in Berlin, where the real secrets lived? The Americans loved it. The CIA had money, ambition, and a growing appetite for the audacious. What they needed was someone willing to run an operation where a single mistake meant tanks. They found their man in William King Harvey. Harvey is one of those figures who seems too vivid to be real. He was heavy-set, thick-necked, with a voice like a gravel truck, and a pistol he was known to set on the table during meetings. He had come to the CIA from the FBI, which he left after falling out with J. Edgar Hoover himself, a man not famous for forgiving. He drank heavily and early, and he trusted almost no one, which in his line of work was less a flaw than a qualification. Behind the bluster sat a genuinely brilliant intelligence officer, one of the few who understood that the Soviets were probably reading American secrets too, and that paranoia, properly aimed, was just good tradecraft. Lunn and Harvey, Peter and Bill. In the classified paperwork, the operation carried a code name built from their first initials. To the Americans, it was Operation Gold. To the British, Operation Stopwatch. To history, simply the Berlin Tunnel. The plan was, on its face, insane. They would dig from the American sector, under the border, into the Soviet zone, and come up beneath a set of cables running alongside a busy road on the far side. Those cables carried traffic to and from Soviet military headquarters and lines connecting Moscow to its outposts across the east. Tap them, and you would not be stealing one secret. You would be sitting inside the nervous system of the enemy, listening to it think. The target lay a few hundred yards inside hostile territory. The tunnel would need to run close to a quarter of a mile. By one comparison, laid on end, it would have stood taller than the Empire State Building. And it would have to pass some 20 feet underground, straight beneath a guarded border, without a single soldier above ever suspecting the ground under his boots was hollow. Then there was the small matter of where to hide it. You cannot dig a quarter-mile tunnel without producing a mountain of dirt, and you cannot leave a mountain of dirt on the edge of a divided city without someone asking questions. So they built a cover. A warehouse went up in the American sector, the kind of dull, official building that invites no curiosity. Inside, engineers dug a basement far deeper than any warehouse would ever need, and it was into that basement that the excavated earth disappeared. Thousands of tons of Berlin, hauled backward out of the tunnel and stacked in the dark so the world would never see the hole growing beneath it. Every problem solved created a new one. The digging equipment threw off heat. Heat, the engineers realized, might rise through 20 feet of soil and melt the frost on the surface, drawing a thin, damp, snowless line across the ground that pointed like an arrow straight to their secret. Men whose job was espionage found themselves worrying about the temperature of the grass. And the closer they crept to the cables, the worse the stakes became. The lines they were hunting sat only a couple of feet below the surface, beside a road where East German traffic passed all day. One collapse, one sinkhole, one curious repair crew, and the whole enterprise would surface into daylight in the worst possible place, under a foreign army, in a city where the wrong incident could put two nuclear powers eye to eye. They dug anyway. Inch by inch, month by month, they pushed a lit, breathing, machine-filled corridor under the feet of the Soviet army. And near the end of it, British engineers did the most delicate thing of all. They reached up, found the cables, and tapped them, spliced into the enemy's own wires so gently that the current on the other side never so much as flickered. By May of 1955, the line was live. The West could hear. Here is where the story turns, and where it becomes something stranger and sadder than a simple tale of clever men and a clever hole. Because the Soviets already knew. They had known for well over a year. They had known before the warehouse was built, before the first shovel bit into the ground, before Harvey and Lunn had finished arguing over the plans. The most secret operation of the early Cold War was betrayed while it was still an idea on a table in London, and the man who did it had been in the room. His name was George Blake. Blake was not what anyone pictured when they pictured a traitor. He was earnest, hard-working, deeply religious, well-liked. He had been born in Rotterdam, joined the resistance against the Nazis as a young man, escaped occupied Europe, and made his way into British intelligence, where his gift for languages and his quiet competence carried him upward. He was, by every outward sign, exactly the sort of officer the service was built on. Then came Korea. Blake was posted there, and when the war swept over him, he was captured and held prisoner. Somewhere in that captivity, in the cold, in the long hours, in whatever combination of conviction and pressure that only he ever fully understood, George Blake changed sides. He came home in 1953 to a hero's welcome, a returning captive, a man who had suffered for his country. And he went straight back to work for British intelligence as a servant of the KGB. When the tunnel was first discussed, Blake was there. He sat in the planning meetings. He took the minutes. He wrote down in his own careful hand the details of the operation, and then he handed them to his Soviet contact. Before Harvey ever chose the site, before Lunn ever ran his first calculation, the men in Moscow had read the plan for the tunnel that was meant to spy on them. Sit with that for a moment, because it changes the shape of everything. Every heroic detail we just walked through, the hidden basement, the thousands of tons of dirt, the fear of melting snow, the surgeon's touch on the cables, all of it was performed for an audience that already had the script. The men digging that tunnel believed they were the hunters. From the very first day, they were the ones being watched. Now the Soviets faced a genuinely difficult decision, and how they answered it is the most interesting thing in the whole affair. They could have simply stopped it. A quiet order, a sudden roadwork crew, an accidental discovery early on, and the tunnel would have died in its cradle. But there was a problem. Only a tiny circle in Moscow knew about Blake. If the Soviets moved too precisely, if they blocked the operation in a way that showed they had known the plan in advance, they risked pointing a finger straight at their own source, save the tunnel's victims, and they might lose the spy. And a spy inside British intelligence was worth more than any single tunnel. So they made a cold, patient choice. They let it happen. They let the Americans dig. They let the British tap the lines. They let the West believe it had pulled off a masterstroke. To protect one man in London, the KGB allowed the enemy to sit inside its communications for the better part of a year. Which raises the question that has kept historians arguing for decades. If the Soviets knew the West was listening, did they feed it lies? You would think so. That would be the obvious play. Fill the lines with false troop movements, phantom divisions, deliberate misdirection, and turn the West's great triumph into a poisoned well. It is exactly what a spy novel would do. But reality was messier, and the mess is the whole point. To feed convincing lies down those cables, the Soviets would have had to tell their own people to lie. Thousands of officers, clerks, and signalmen across East Germany would have needed to know the lines were tapped in order to perform for the microphones. And the moment you tell thousands of people a secret, it is no longer a secret. Worse, the knowledge would have crept toward the ordinary Soviet military, and from there it might have circled back and exposed the very source they were protecting. The only way to keep Blake safe was to let the traffic stay real, and so it did. The quartermasters kept complaining about fuel. The officers kept griping about the cold. The whole grumbling, gossiping, unglamorous life of an army went on down those wires, honestly, because honesty was the safest thing. That detail may seem like a footnote. It is closer to the hinge on which the entire story swings. For 11 months, the tunnel drank. The scale of what came out of that hole is hard to hold in the mind. Tens of thousands of hours of telephone conversations. Millions of hours of teletype traffic clattering through the tap. Reels of tape stacked by the thousand, hauled out of Berlin and shipped to teams of translators who worked around the clock and still could not keep up. The raw take was so enormous that analysts were still combing through it years after the tunnel itself was gone. And it was, as far as the CIA could ever tell, genuine. Not the war-starting revelations of legend, no red-lettered order to invade, no single call that changed the world. Something quieter and, in its way, more useful. The everyday texture of the Soviet military, which units sat where, who reported to whom, how the East German and Soviet forces actually functioned when they thought no one was in the room. The kind of ground-level truth that lets an analyst in Washington finally replace a guess with a fact. For a West that had spent years staring into the dark, guessing at the size of the shape in the room, that was worth a great deal. They had wanted to know what the Soviet army really was day to day in its own unguarded voice. Now they knew. The men in the warehouse did not know their secret was shared. They thought they had gotten away with it. And in a strange, backward way, that belief may have been the most valuable thing they had. Because it meant they treated the intelligence as real, and the intelligence, as it turned out, mostly was. The ending, when it came, was theatre. By the spring of 1956, the tunnel was in trouble on its own terms. Heavy rain had seeped into the ground and into the cables, and faults were spreading through the network above the tap. Soviet signal crews came out to find the problem, and the Soviets, watching their own calendar, decided the moment had arrived. Blake had moved on. The trail was cold enough. They could discover the tunnel now without leading anyone back to him. So they staged it. What looked from the West like bad luck, a maintenance crew stumbling onto a tap while chasing a rain-damaged line, was, at least in part, a performance the KGB had been waiting more than a year to give. In the small hours, dozens of men appeared along the cable and began to dig, and in the warehouse the listeners understood at last that it was over. Then the Soviets did something that tells you how the game was really played. They turned the discovery into a spectacle. They peeled back the tunnel, put it on display, walked reporters through the American sap running under their streets, and denounced the whole thing as a gangster act, a violation of every decent norm between nations. They meant to embarrass the West. They meant to drive a wedge between the Americans and the British. It did not land the way they hoped. The press and much of the watching public looked at the tunnel and did not see a crime. They saw nerve. They saw a quarter-mile of engineering shoved under an enemy army, and they were, frankly, impressed. Somewhere down in that tunnel, before the Soviets sealed it, a sign is said to have been left facing the men who found it, with the dry courtesy of an occupied city. You are now entering the American sector. The propaganda stunt curdled into an advertisement for CIA audacity. The Soviets had won the operation and lost the story. For years afterward, the West did not understand what had actually happened to it. The tunnel was thought of as a success cut short by weather and bad luck, a good run that ended when the rain got in. The truth stayed buried for another 5 years until George Blake was finally exposed, confessed, and was tried in secret in London. His sentence was staggering: 42 years, one of the longest terms ever handed down in a British court. It did not hold him. In 1966, Blake escaped from prison and made his way across Europe to Moscow, where he lived out a long life as an honoured guest of the state he had chosen. He never expressed the remorse his old colleagues wanted from him. To the end, he insisted he had believed in something. Only when Blake fell did the men who had built the tunnel finally grasp the shape of what they had lived through. The masterstroke had been an open secret from the day it was drawn. The hunters had been watched from the first shovelful, and yet, this is the part that refuses to sit still, the intelligence had been real. The betrayal had, in the strangest sense, failed to matter as much as it should have, because the price of exploiting it fully was one the Soviets could not afford to pay. So what was the Berlin Tunnel? A triumph or a disaster? It depends entirely on where you stand. Betrayed before it began, it should have been a catastrophe, and in the ledger of secrets kept and lost, it was. But it still delivered a flood of genuine intelligence, still humiliated its enemies in the eyes of the world, still stands as one of the boldest things either side attempted in 40 years of Cold War. It was a failure and a success wearing the same face, and no one who was there could ever quite agree on which one they had been part of. That is the thing about the whole trade, really. Both sides dug and listened and betrayed and congratulated themselves, and at the end of it, the honest lesson is how little anyone truly controlled. The Americans thought they were listening in secret. The Soviets thought they were running the deception, and the truth slipped down the wires between them, largely by accident, because keeping the lie going was harder than telling it straight. There is one question that has never been fully answered, and maybe never will be. If George Blake had never sat in that London room, if the plan had stayed secret the way its builders believed it had, would the West have learned anything more than it did? Or did the betrayal, in its clumsy, self-defeating way, hand them the one thing money and courage could not? The certainty that what they were hearing was true? Nobody knows. The men who could have told us are gone, and the tunnel is sealed, and the ground over it is quiet again. If stories like this one, the ones where the winners and losers keep trading places, are the kind you want more of, stay a while. There are more of them here than you'd think.